analysis that's very inspired by the work of Maurice in this paper on meta-cybernetics and market capitalism. I find this work compelling, groundbreaking, and just awesome. And he's truly crafted this approach that addresses the complexities of like these capitalist systems that go well beyond our typical models and metrics for those in economics. So his framework that dives into this mindset agency theory through this integration of the cognitive, affective, and spiritual dimensions. This inclusion is something we rarely see in economic discourse, especially the spiritual dimension. The last time it was really utilized in any serious context would go back to Max Weber. And then you can see some stuff done by Virgil Storr and Solomon Stein. But even then, the depth of it isn't to the same level of our gracious host here. And so one of the things I find most fascinating and remarkable about this paper is the depth of the philosophical grounding. I mean, in modern academics, especially in economics, we often see a heavy focus on these models, system-driven frameworks, and this tends to obscure the philosophical basis that informs why certain choices or interactions are modeled in specific ways. And so this approach departs from that trend and it infuses this analysis with the philosophical and even spiritual dimensions that help ground these ideas in something more enduring and foundational. And I find that beautiful. And someone myself who deeply believes in this integration of spirituality with economic and political behavior, there's an immense value here in this spiritual dimension for this modeling. And like this approach, right? It really bridges between the quantitative rigor of economics and moves into a better understanding qualitatively, where economic behaviors are influenced not just by material incentives, but by values, beliefs, and ethical frameworks that underpin our actions. And this is something that he brought up, neo-institutionalism. Neo-institutionalism really tries to move towards this, but it always lacks something, right? You have people like Munger and well, anyway, there are people out there that just kind of take it as given and they don't actually try to pin down these values beliefs. So I'm going to be pushing back a little bit on this, and we kind of opened this up in the discussion that I had because I think there's a broad misunderstanding of capitalism that comes from Adam Smith and why people misunderstand it. A lot of this is going to be based on the work of Vernon Smith and his book on humanomics, and this is also the way I read Adam Smith as opposed to the way some people tend to read him. So this characterization of Adam Smith's capital as like an extreme idealized form of free market capitalism, this is quite common in economic discourse, but I don't think that's true. I think that's a misinterpretation of Adam Smith. And if we want to look at capitalism from Adam Smith, we have to rely on more than just the wealth of nations. We have to consider the theory of moral sentiments. And this provides the philosophical foundation for his economic theories. The invisible hand that Smith famously describes is not a mechanism of the free market, not purely a mechanism of free market self-regulation. It's a moral philosophy rooted in common sense realism, right? And this comes from the Scottish Enlightenment. And the purpose of this was that it was fundamentally at odds with the Calvinistic doctrine of total depravity that was extremely prevalent at the time during the Scottish Enlightenment. Yeah. And so this theory of moral sentiments, the term altruism isn't used, but the principle of mutual sympathy is, right? And so we call this empathy. For Smith, self-interest isn't a purely individualistic or isolated notion. It's embedded within his ethical framework where each person's choices are evaluated not just by the direct outcome of oneself, but by an internal spectator, a conscious that considers the impacts on others. And so when we think about this, we have to really delve deeper into his understanding of self-interest. And so let's consider that concept that we were just talking about, the sympathy, or as he calls it, fellow feeling. In this framework, sympathy is not just a moral sentiment. It's a fundamental part of how self-interest operates within society. Again, mutual sympathy is what aligns our world about achieving a resonant relationship with others. So this would be dialogical reciprocity. And again, this is what fellow feeling is. It's not necessarily altruistic in its pure sense, but it's the recognition of the well being of ours is connected to the well being of the others. So for Smith, self interest includes this desire to live harmoniously and ethically within a community. And this is essential to the invisible hand concept, where self regulation is balanced by an internal sense of propriety and social responsibility. And Adam Smith's philosophy suggests that even as we pursue our interests, we are guided by a context dependent rules of conduct. So our actions are not solely aimed at, maximizing personal gains, but they are signals to others within a framework of mutual understanding and dialogical reciprocity. So, given that this context sensitivity here, actions gain meaning through the context, and choices aren't evaluated in isolation. They're interpreted as part of a social exchange where actions, again, send signals back and forth for this dialogical uh, reciprocity. And we also need to unpack this idea that, you know, I prefer more of a resource rather than less. And I can assess the intent behind a person's actions. So if someone chooses to give more to the other in a given context, that action is recognized as beneficial within a social framework. This is an enhancement to harmony. And we can also know that self-serving actions without regard for others disrupts social bonds and trusts. And this is important to understand in Adam Smith's work, because he saw these actions as messages within a moral conversation. And others read and respond, leading to the growth of what we would call social capital. This doesn't deny self-interest, but it redefines the way self-interest needs to be understood in the capitalist context, where social fitness norms moderate our conduct and promote long-term harmony. This is the basis of ethical self-governance, actions guided by inner moral standards that align with community well-being. So in this, he did discuss the fourth order. And so I think it's important to describe what I consider to be the fourth order and how I think that this shift is important. So his approach is rooted in third order cybernetics, and again he does explicate the fourth, but third order is reflexive, self-developing environments where multiple agents are within a shared evolving space. And so systems function as a self-developing community or polysubject environments, and each part reflects on itself and the larger system. But I believe a fourth order perspective can address a deeper and transformative element of Yoel's spiritual dimension, elements like transcendence, interconnectedness, and the pursuit of the greater good. These qualities I see as integral to the spirit of the market, especially from the Weberian sense and from the Sorokonian sense. And this naturally points us towards this fourth order framework where the ethical pursuit of the collective well being isn't merely balanced or reflexive, but is harmonized and unified at a more fundamental level. So, in my view, we'll take an idea of like environmental ethics, right? This is an example of why this shift matters. I don't have an environmental ethic. I don't think it's necessary to have an environmental ethic. I have unethic. Our relationship to the environment reflects our duty to creation, not as a separate ethical topic, but as an integrated part of who we are and how we should live. This reflects a fourth order ethic rather than treating the environmental stewardship as a distinct pursuit in businesses and in stakeholders. We are bound by an ontological responsibility to live harmoniously within creation as co-workers with God. Now, an additional thing to note here is the substructure and superstructure model presents two ontological layers, ethical norms. Say it again. Okay.
Yes.
Two ontological
Go ahead.
sorry, two ontological norms, right? We've got ethical norms and observable actions. They interact dialectically through feedback, feed forward processes, right? And this structure, while effective, it still implies a duality where we have emergent properties result from reconciling opposing elements, right? But we need to move past this into a non-dual integration. This is where holomerism rather than holarchic systems comes into play. So I'm borrowing from Torstein Tolfsen's Christian Metaphysics of St. Maximus the Confessor. Polymerism is a framework in which the universal exists within each particular. It means that there's no nature without hypostasis. The universal reality only exists as instantiated in particular beings. So each part embodies the whole, and each particular contains the essence of the universal. So this is an interwoven reality where there's no true separation between whole and part, as they are mutually dependent and integrated in a non-dialectical unity. And this is important when we were just discussing these categories versus taxonomies, et cetera, because the goal is to actually look at them as an ontologically collapsed reality, rather than having a dialectical form. So, in this holomeric framework, individuals don't merely reflect societal norms and reflect on them. They are an embodiment of those intrinsically, participating as both distinct individuals and as interconnected elements of the whole. This has profound implications for human agency in this MAT. So the human person is both a unique individual and a cosmic bond. It's meant to unite all of creation with the divine. So in the context of fourth order cybernetics, holomerism allows us to understand systems as both distinct and wholly interconnected, and that this fourth order doesn't balance parts, it integrates them ethically and ontologically. And this leads us to the essential principle of what is referenced in this paper and what also Aristotle discusses as the good. But I would argue it would be better understood by Petrem Sorokin's concept of ontological love, which again, this brought up and this just blew my mind when I was reading this. So in the framework achieved, we have this something beyond mere reflexive harmony, right? But we need a transformative alignment of individual and collective aims with self-sustaining ethical framework of love. So Sorokin's idea of ontological love, as it's going to apply to this analysis, for Sorokin, love is an ontological force. It's a transformative moral power that's going to be driving ethical behavior within social networks and systems. And by introducing this concept, we bring an essential quality to fourth order framework, where spirit acts as a guiding principle and love becomes the force of transformation that underpins these ethical interactions. So in this framework, the wholeness and interconnectedness of the system correspond to the spirit that Yoel emphasizes, while transformative powers that directs actions towards this good that he brings up is ontological love. So in Christian thought, God is identified with love, and among the persons of the Trinities, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit is often specifically with particularity of love. Figures like St. Augustine, St. Gregory Palamas, and St. Gennadios speak to this association, describing love as an expression of the Spirit's unique personal characteristics. So in this model, spirit includes like the cognitive and affective dimensions within this MAT. But if we add Sorokin's concept of ontological love as transformation, we can align this with the fourth order perspective back down to the third order perspective if we view ontological love as an order of social reflexivity. So in a circuit of adaptation, love becomes the active force that redirects the behavior and decisions in a way that integrates reflexively. So in this sense, spirit in the system doesn't just represent the interconnectedness, but it operates energetically as love. Spirit and love are thus distinct, yet they are interconnected. The energetic aspect of spirit is love itself, and this love guides the ethical and moral realities in the pursuit of the good. And the moral and ethical reality isn't defined by utility maximization, but by multi-layered adaptability, where ethical coherence is achieved by not imposing a rigid ethical model, but by allowing diverse parts to harmonize through love. And here's where we get into my piece of the arena, right? Public policy as an empirical arena for this, right? How does love impact economic and political decision-making processes? For my analysis, I focused on public policy, which Hume famously characterized as driven by the underlying sentiments and passions that divide and unify. So, public policy is the unity in diversity. This is the balancing act that reflects the collective and sometimes conflicting sentiments within society. And this is where cybernetics comes in. In public policy, we see sentiments shared, relational, and co-manifested by individuals and systems through complex communication networks. So to capture this dynamic, I propose a solidarity model that looks at the overlapping communications based on the multi-helix network structure to assess how different actors reach a shared understanding. So to kind of illustrate this, like think of King Arthur's round table as a metaphor for like the policy making arena. Now you have delegates from various interest groups. Each are going to be representing a distinct perspective. They're gathering to present their policy proposals to the policymaker or King Arthur. And each interest group has its own agenda, unique demands, and divergent ideas on how to address all of these shared concerns. And this creates a web of interconnected yet conflicting interests. But as the lords engage in their own discussion through their own communications, the King Arthur encourages this dialogue. We really want to foster an atmosphere of trust and cooperation. Ultimately, what ends up happening is the delegates begin to find common ground. They're going to recognize areas where their goals overlap. And through this cooperative process, which is also competitive, the complex web of competing interests untangles as this solidarity grows. And formerly opposing parties discover pathways towards a shared policy direction. So, in this analogy, we have the emergence of solidarity, and this simplifies and clarifies the policymaking process. This is the reduction of complexity. And so, distilling all of these competing interests into a unified proposal is going to reflect the collective voice of the people. And so, as we've reduced policy complexity through this mutual influence and collaboration, we've led to a clear course of action for King Arthur, and it's going to be rooted in the largest consensus and informed by the shared interests of all represented parties. And so, this model demonstrates how solidarity fosters both mutual influence and policy coherence in public decision-making processes. Now, I just jumped from love into solidarity. How do we connect these two? I would argue that solidarity emerges from altruistic love, as proposed by Peacham Sorkin. And Sorkin describes love as the highest form of human connection, a force that drives human behavior towards unity and mutual understanding. For Sorkin, love represents the supreme and vital form of relationship, one that transforms our social interactions into collaborative, solidaristic forms of action. So in this model, I use network analysis techniques like the triple helix indicator modified, and this reveals a degree of mutual influence between actors. And then you take this and you endogenize that solidarity variable from that mutual influence within the network clicks, and then we can measure and track levels of cooperation and alignment of goals within the network. And this enables us to quantify solidarity among actors. And this is especially valuable in political network analysis, which mostly focuses on things like eigenvalues of centrality and stuff like that. But it helps us identify key actors, the structure of those relationships, and the patterns of collaboration. Say that again. Okay.
It's just some disturbance.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So
the time is almost up. So
okay, I'm almost done, I promise. So Sorkin's concept of love as an ontological energy into this analysis, we gain insight into how altruistic love can transform social and political interactions. And Sorkin's idea that love is an ontological force emphasizes how altruism, as explored in the literature on interdependent preferences, suggests that collective agency often depends on shared goals rather than individual gain, going back to what I was talking about with Adam Smith. And so solidarity is more than collaboration. It's a form of mutual interiority where actors are connected by a shared reality that reduces policy complexity and drives transformation. Sorokin's concept of love as a binding force illuminates how, in the presence of love, the competing interests within political and economic systems don't just coexist, but find coherence. And through creating policy that reflects both a diversity and unity through a multi-layered ethical and adaptable systems context. And then finally, just to wrap everything up, I want to again say thank you so much to Maurice for this. This has been fantastic. I loved reading this. I probably read it like 15 times in a row. But again, we started by exploring his work on cognitive, affective, and spiritual dimensions through this mindset agency theory. We looked at Adam Smith's moral framework and reflexivity. We've looked at moving from third order to fourth order cybernetics and looked at how holomerism saw each part of a system that embodies the whole, leading to non-dialectical unity. And then we have how ethical coherence naturally emerges from the system, and how building on this type of holomerism, the concept of ontological love as an ontological force becomes the energetic dimension of spirit and helps align individual and societal aims. And then public policy, how we are using solidarity and policy networks to understand what's going on and the embedding of context within the political system. But again, thank you so much, everyone. I hope y'all have enjoyed this, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening and reading your work.
Can I answer?
Yeah. Please.
Okay. Thank you. An interesting presentation. Firstly, I used Adam Smith as a way of getting in to market capitalism. I wasn't particularly interested in the details of Adam Smith's work or his underlying philosophy. It was just a means. So his deeper dimensions are interesting, and thank you for that. Your consideration of fourth order, I've defined it as really a transformative option, but it can have more than that. For instance, my third order, sustentation, has knowledge. It has other aspects as well. It has a feature for homeostasis. In my second second order, you have which I call disposition. You have regulation. You have theory. You have other elements that go together. So just because I've defined fourth order in the way I have doesn't mean that it doesn't allow for other elements to enter. It was designed for a specific purpose, which was to satisfy the needs of my colleague, an Italian colleague, who is running this project. But it's quite easily open to elaboration by other dimensions. Sorokin's ontological love fits okay in my modeling approach. So, yeah, thank you.
Aaron?
Yes, thank you, both presenters. Very deep. Perhaps I look at this as from a different angle, actually, because I work in the oil business still, And when I present something like this, cybernetics and so on, it's very difficult for the CEO to understand it. So my work last few years has been to reduce it to simple, and I found two algorithms to simplify things that with the cybernetical knowledge we have, with biological knowledge, with physics, we can now reduce it to two algorithms, one for functionality and one for dysfunctionality. So dysfunctional systems, for example, market capitalism is dysfunctional. Why? Because it is based upon a selection of information. Information connected to energy, which is, either is energy or is equivalent to energy, will make that information shortage or deficit or overload will give you a dysfunctionality function, because that, as cybernetics says, feedback needs to be put in for the system to regulate itself and correct itself. So all the systems that do not allow feedback are dysfunctional. This is actually a conclusion that I made. So when we reduce this quite complex elaboration of all kinds of sciences and so on, we would come down to this, that ethics is information. And without ethics, we have an information deficit, so systems won't work. What do you think about that? Either.
So first, one pushback is that market economies are dysfunctional because they don't operate on feedback. I'm confused by that, because the whole purpose of the market economy is that the feedback and feed forward is through the price system, right? Like, it's a signaling mechanism that provides the information, and the information is localized. That there's an asymmetry of information, but all things have an asymmetry of information. So we can't ever encapsulate the full information, but it's the lack of information from one thing to the next is what allows entrepreneurial realities to exist. But that being said, that ethics is dysfunctional because there's not full information. I mean, I'm not 100% sure from my standpoint. From one, a fourth order system necessitates a broad generalized ethic, right? And so for me, it would be, you're either going to have eudaimonia of Aristotle, or you're going to have ontological love and a Christian metaphysical ethic. And I think those are the only two viable options in any type of fourth order system. So whether or not we can say it's purely consequence of our reality, that's one way. But I would think that because it's information, because it's energy, I don't know if you've seen some of my other ones, information and energy are the proof of God's existence within the Eastern Orthodox Church. So by that nature, the ethical reality of those energies and information, it would be still aligning with God in a higher order, downward causality.
Yeah, well,
Could I ask for clarification here? In particular, are you distinguishing between positive and negative feedback with feed forward processes or not?
Yeah, well, positive feedback.
Yeah, well, no. There's. Are you asking about in market economies for feed?
I'm asking about your usage of the terms.
No. I'm using it in the proper sense of feed forward, like you would have in a neural network.
Neural network.
But the feedback to correct the